Good afternoon, everyone. When last we left off, the war was over. The stage was set for the East versus West, the Soviet Union versus the Western countries of Great Britain, France, and America. We talked about how American military innovation, such as the atomic bomb, made it impossible for Stalin to make more land grabs than what he already did. We talked about how Truman had started the theory of containment, and then we had gone on to talk about the crisis on Iran. After the war, Truman proposes a doctrine, it would be titled the Truman Doctrine, in which he wants to target Greece and Turkey. The USSR had begun focusing a lot of their attention towards Turkey and Greece, is that they were both warm water ports and could get a lot of their shipping up and running. This was important for the spread of communism to some of the satellite states of the Soviet Union and their new territories and other places. So Truman did not want that to happen. He knew if the Soviets got a warm water port, it would be very devastating for the American containment theory. So Truman proposes and asks Congress for $400 million to help fight communism. And a lot of that money went to supporting anti-communist governments or anti-communist partisans. Truman in Europe also had another proposal. He proposed the Marshall Plan. This gave money to European nations to aid in the rebuilding. Now, he did this because the Soviet Union, after the war, had left a path of destruction in Western Europe, obviously, or Eastern Europe, West Europe, France, Norway. All these countries have been completely destroyed just due to Allied attacks, fighting against the Germans and the Nazi army. So the Soviets were like, we don't care what you do. We are not getting any of our money. Marshall knew that he could get a lot of support and turn a lot of countries away from communism if he proposed to pay them to rebuild. So billions of dollars of supplies was sent, machinery was sent, food, and just money were pumped into Western Europe. And this really gained favor in a lot of the European countries that could have gone into a more Soviet-friendly state. We had talked yesterday about how after the war, the Germany was split, and how Berlin was specifically split. So in 1948, the U.S. officials had determined that the only real way of stopping the Soviets from destroying the German economy was to have the U.S., Great Britain, and France all merge their territories and allow the Germans to govern themselves. This new state became West Germany, and it completely separated from the Soviet Union-controlled East Germany. There was two Germanys all the way up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union. During this time, Berlin had been cut off. So West Berlin had been under the control of the Allied forces of America, Great Britain, and France. The Americans had been allowing them a lot more freedom. They had more money than the Soviets. They had more autonomy. And the East Berliners were basically under Soviet occupation, and the Soviets weren't real friendly to Germany because the Nazi army had not been real friendly to Soviet citizens. So they basically kept them on lockdown and treated them really poorly, didn't allow them to have money, didn't allow them to have freedom. And in order to try and cut Berlin off from the West, what the Soviet Union did was they built a wall and cut off all rail and road supplies, or road traffic, going into West Berlin. Now, this isn't the Berlin Wall. This is the outer perimeter of the city, not the inside quite yet. The Berlin Airlift came started in June of 1948. The goal was to get food and supplies to West Berlin and East Berlin because they all needed it. It would trickle down through. So the target was that we needed to get 9,000 tons or 90,000 tons. It was a lot of supplies that needed to get through to the city. The Soviet Union basically laughed because in the first week we did not have the capacity to do so. By the end of the Berlin airlift, we would have delivered twice the necessary, and it made the Soviet Union look very, very, very bad. So they allowed for road traffic and air traffic. There's a really good podcast out called What We Saw. Just a second, I'll look it up for you all. The Cold War, What We Saw, if you're interested. And one of the episodes talks about the Berlin airlift and how incredible it was. It's definitely worth a listen if you like that kind of Cold War stuff, the early Cold War. It's by Bill Whittle. He talks a lot about it. He lived through it. And he talks about how there was one air lane that they could go and they could fly. And that saw a ton of traffic. One plane every 12 minutes had to be loaded, sent over, and then unloaded, and then back again. So that was going every day, 24 hours a day. At the end of World War II, we had dropped the atomic bombs. So Truman sent long-range bombers armed with nuclear weapons to bases in Great Britain. We had essentially been preparing to nuke Russia, to drop atomic bombs on Russia in the event that they decided to invade West Germany. And there was a very, very real threat of that happening. Russia had, instead of demilitarizing after World War II, had amped up production in a lot of places. And they had no real reason to stop. They wanted to keep going. Stalin obviously was hungry for more power, more land. And so there was a really real possibility at that early stage that America had to use an atomic bomb. During this time, it looked like we were the only ones that had the atomic bomb, but in reality, the Russians had secretly been building on theirs, and it would not be quite successful, but it would be a few months later that it would be. For nearly a year, the Americans' planes carried the supplies into West Berlin until Stalin removed the blockade. As I said, we did the impossible, and we fed an entire city of millions of people off of airdrops. So it was really, really incredible, and it was really a score 1 for the West and score 0 for the communist Soviets. That really made the American side look good early on. After the war, NATO would be formed. This is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this was a treaty between essentially the Western countries of U.S., Canada, Great Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Denmark, Portugal, Netherlands, Norway, Luxembourg, and Iceland. And the idea was that if any one of these nations were to be attacked, they would all go in. It would be. We talked about in World War I how treaties had pulled everyone into the war. Well, that was kind of a step back to that. So if any one of these, even Luxembourg, which is a small place, got attacked, or Norway, which the Soviets really did want, they would all go to war. It was the first time that the U.S. had committed to protect Europe, which was huge because America, as you see, America switches from being isolationist, like we had talked about early on. It switches from isolationism into a more global power because we were one of the few countries left standing after World War II. We were really the only one that was able to take on the Soviet Union and stand up against it, which set up this whole East versus West thing. So America is no longer isolationist. We are now actively involved in a treaty with Europeans and betting to stand up for them in the event of an attack. So this is definitely a change in America, and I really want you to focus on that when you're thinking about the early part of the Cold War. Think about the change in just 50 short years. From the turn of the century, even 40 short years around that 1910, 1920 mark, how we were strictly isolationist, and now we are having to be on a global force. Um, so during this time, China turns communist. Mao Zedong takes over from Shanghai Shek. He kicks them out of the country, and the nationalists form Taiwan. They have a serious goal in spreading communism to other Asian countries. Their closest ally, or their closest target, was the Korean Peninsula. If you don't know, it borders to the south of China. In the northern, more Chinese part, or more geographically close to China, they have a very real connection to the communist government. They identify with Mao Zedong. They think he's got good principles. The southern part, not so much. They're a little bit different culturally as they are farther away. It's a different kind of geographical aspect. The Americans, Truman, saw it and knew that communism was going to spread. So he wanted to stop it as soon as he could, and that would get us involved in the Korean War. So at the end of World War II, American and Soviet troops entered into Korea in order to disarm Japanese troops. Now, Japan had invaded a lot of Asia, and Japan, even after the mainland had surrendered, a lot of the holdouts, a lot of the territories where they had provincial troops did not. They were still wanting to fight. They were still, I think there's stories even 60, 70 years after the war had ended, they found Japanese soldiers on tiny islands that were still armed and shooting at boats passing by. So there was no idea of surrender. So they were going to there to disarm the troops. The Allies divided Korea at the 38th parallel. Now, you can see if you look on slide 22, that's about the middle of the country. So you have South Korea, where the capital is Seoul. And then you have North Korea, which is Pyongyang, is the capital. China borders to the north, which is now communist. You have South Korea, which the Americans are going to immediately start to try and control through proxy. The Soviets and China are starting to control the north. Mao Zedong would actually send troops over the border of North Korea secretly. And then we were really trying to talk because this is 1950s. The relationship between the Soviet Union and the Americans had really broken down. We had talked about peace and just whatever containment, just stop communism where it is. There was real talks at the beginning of the Korean War, right before it starts, really, where they were talking about reuniting, that they were going to have a cooperative government, they were going to be basically socialist, part capitalist, more free economy, but still have the Soviet background. Breaks down completely. The North does not want this. The South does not want this. The Americans don't want this. The Russians, the Soviets, the Chinese, they don't want it. And so this is going to start the Korean War, which is the first real war of the Cold War. You all know why it's called Cold War, right? It's because there's no fighting between the principal nations of the Soviet Union and the West, or America. So if you're following along in the PowerPoint, there's pictures of soldiers in Korea. Say you're crossing the 38th parallel. This is a British soldier, the Royal Ulster Rifles. Just telling you that it's not good. It's dangerous. Here's an American convoy passing the 38th parallel. The Korean War really sets the tone for the 60s, and a lot is going to change about war and how we fight it. Soviets began building a government in the north. Obviously, the Soviet government or the communist government is still around. The DPRK, or Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is what it is called now. It is still communist. It is still run a lot through China, and they're backing it heavily. The Soviets send a lot of military support to try and bring it guns. Chinese would kick in soldiers. And then June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans invaded the South, and then the poorly equipped Koreans were backed all the way, almost completely out of the country. It was horrible because the South Koreans weren't prepared. We hadn't really armed them. We hadn't trained them. Really, the NATO steps in and saves the situation, and we begin training them and giving them better equipment. Truman ordered the U.S. Navy and air power to aid the South Koreans. We had one of the biggest air forces. Air forces were now huge. Our Navy was there. And South Korean American troops were pushed back into the corner of Korea. If you go back to slide 22, if you look very towards the bottom, almost to Busan, that's pretty much where they were pushed back to. General MacArthur had planned the counterattack, and this was the Battle of Incheon. He had planned to invade Incheon and encircle the North Korean army. It worked very well, and they pushed North Korea all the way back. Douglas MacArthur also really tried to lobby Korea, or lobby Truman to use the nukes again, use the atom bomb again, because it was so effective against Japan. He thought that it would quickly solve the problem. Truman didn't like this and would eventually dismiss General MacArthur. As you can see, if you're following along, there's a picture of a soldier sitting on a hill. More soldiers. It was very, very bad. If you see there's a helicopter, U.S. Army helicopter. The helicopter comes around, and it's going to be the quickest way to get troops in and out of action to quickly respond to any threats. Keep this in mind for Vietnam. Actually, really, keep this in mind for the rest of American warfare. It doesn't change. The helicopter is a military invention that revolutionizes basically warfare, because now you have rapid response teams, and that's going to be huge in Vietnam. The next few years of the battle stayed around the 38th parallel. Thanks to the UN forces, they kept pushing them back. The Koreans would invade. The North Koreans would invade, and they get pushed back. The South Koreans would invade, they get pushed back. It was just basically this giant stalemate, and the UN wasn't ready to fight offensively because they knew they would drag China in and potentially draw in the full might of the Soviet Union. So the Korea would be completely separated by the 38th parallel. And today, it still is divided that way. This is what is known as the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone. No one can cross the other side without very, very special permission. If you try and defect from North Korea, they shoot you. It's heavily armed. It's got mines all over it. It's got Americans. The peace negotiations start in November of 1951, but they really they would not be signed until July 50 of 1953. They're hollow peace talks. It's more of an armistice. So we're not going to fight your side. You're not going to fight us. We're just going to pause. The Korean War went on until, I believe, 2016. I have to check that. But so it really didn't end until 2016, because it was just under armistice. They were agreed to stop fighting. At the end of it, more than 36,000 Americans would be dead, and we learned a real thing about a war in Asia, as we'll find out later. If you're following along, there's a YouTube video explains it really well and in depth. Please check it out. So back on the home front, we talked about communism growing and expanding, obviously into Korea. There are some other places, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They're going to turn they're going to have communist revolutions. Afghanistan, a few of those places are going to start to have. You're going to start to see communist revolutions happen, or communist groups form. There was a very real fear in America that communism was going to spread and take over America. This was known as the Red Scare. We had talked in World War One, a little bit before and after, how there was a Red Scare then, and how people were scared of immigrants bringing over communism. From the early communists of the Soviet Union, Lenin, early Trotsky, early Stalin, had been bringing over, or they thought they had been bringing over. Remember the Sacco Vanzetti trial? They thought they were immigrant communists, but they were anarchists. Um, so this Red Scare was mainly propagated by Senator Joseph McCarthy, and he is basically going out on TV and saying that this actor is a communist, this congressperson they're a communist, saying that communists have infiltrated everywhere, that they're going to infiltrate the U.S. government, and that they are everywhere, and they're going to take over, and we're going to go to communists. People were scared. They thought that everyone you knew was a communist, and so people were not trusting their neighbors. There was real suspicion of people. They would arrest people for communism. They executed a few people because they thought they were communism. They thought they were spies. There were several people in the White House that were accused of being KGB members, which was the Soviet secret police that would basically be the Gestapo. So they had a review process. It was a program. It was a board, and they screened all federal employees to assess their loyalty to the U.S. and not to communism. 2,000 quit their jobs under pressure, and 212 people were fired for questionable loyalty. This would later be known as McCarthyism. So, as I said, Joseph McCarthy was a senator who accused people of being communist. This damaged the reputations of prominent people in America, used questioning tactics that some felt covered up his own guilt. There was a huge amount of people that believed that McCarthy himself was a communist and a spy, and that he was using that to hide. He was using his accusations to hide his own guilt in it. People were afraid to confront McCarthy, though, because he would immediately snap on them and say, "You're a communist for asking me that." And then he was well liked by a certain subsect of the demographic. There's going to be there's going to be an escalation in the atomic scares. As I said, shortly after we had dropped the bombs, dropped the bombs on Japan, the Soviet Union had built their own bombs, and now there's a race. Truman, we had known what was called the atomic bomb. Now we had Americans became upset when the USSR began testing the H bomb, which is the hydrogen bomb, which is what we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We began running drills to protect the public in the event that the bombs did drop. If you ever look up on YouTube, look up duck and cover drills. They are really interesting. They're really kind of like, wow, if there was a bomb, I'm just going to duck under the table and that'll work. Spoiler, it wouldn't work, but there was a fear all over America that at any moment we would have an atomic war with Russia. And so this is going to lead into an arms race that will lead to a lot of scary stuff and scary incidents. In the 50s, I didn't talk about it. We had begun spying on the Soviet Union. They've been spying on us. Back to that whole point of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. They had spies. There's no doubt that they were spying on America, but we were doing the same. And if you ever want a cool story, look up the U-2 that fell in the Soviet Union. It's a really cool story. Tom Hanks has a movie about it, I believe. He's a movie about everything. That's where I'm going to end it for today. If you have any questions, as always, email me or Mr. Webster. Have a good evening.